Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome back to State of the Hack. You're here with Evan Pena, myself, and
Julian Pileggi. Hello.
We're here today to talk to you a little bit about attacker OpSec and why it's important for attackers and red teamers alike, or essentially anyone doing sort of offensive security, to implement OpSec in your methodology, and how attackers are doing the same, and why it's important. For the red team, it's important for attribution. The last thing we really want to do on a red team is get caught. For one, generally one of the objectives is to be stealthy. And two, if there's attribution to FireEye or Mandiant, or even the individual red teamer that's actually conducting the red team, it's a little bit embarrassing. We try to avoid that where possible. It's not always possible, and everyone has different experience with OpSec, but sometimes it does happen. And usually an objective is try to avoid any attribution towards us as well. And the reason we do that is because, again, we're trying to emulate real APT threat groups and real attackers. And most of the time they do a decent job at OpSec, not always the best. But again, at the end of the day, we're trying to represent our company, and we're also trying to be a bit stealthy and make sure that we cover our tracks there and try not to attribute it back to us. And it also keeps investigators kind of going down different paths to try to identify who's actually behind this. And that's just part of the methodology when it comes to that. Joan, you have anything to talk about when it comes to like what you observe real attackers do when it comes to OpSec?
Yeah, so it really depends on the motivation. So, the operational security of an attacker is typically higher when they're more motivated to stay in an environment for longer, especially if they're doing some kind of espionage or information theft over a long period of time, versus attackers that still use more persistent techniques, but maybe have shorter term objectives like ransomware, for example, or extortion. They're more like a smash and grab. They want to get in, and maybe they don't care as much about having higher levels of OpSec or operational security because they don't really care. They don't know, once they've encrypted the entire environment, their main objective is complete, and now you either have to pay them for a decryption key or negotiate for something like that, or potentially recover from backups if you can. But oftentimes with more sophisticated threat actors that we might end up designating as an APT group, you will see higher levels of operational security where they're really trying to make sure that they're not detected, or even if they are detected and identified, they have sometimes really good ways to quickly remove the evidence of what they've done in the environment before the investigators really fully understand the full scope of what they're starting to investigate.
Yeah, it would be really embarrassing too if we're doing a red team engagement and there is some detection and there is attribution associated with the individual employee who did it. Maybe they wrote a tool or something that has some evidence of their name involved in it, whether it be in the comments or whether it be a public GitHub page that's associated with their specific name. And if there was no deconfliction associated with that engagement, they could go down that route and really try to arrest that person or escalate it too high. So it's also really important to make sure that there's levels of deconfliction in terms of the rules of engagement for a red team so that you can avoid that situation in the event that there is sort of attribution associated with you or your company. For the red team side, the way this usually starts for us is a huge emphasis on infrastructure, red team infrastructure, and getting started on a red team engagement. There's a lot of OpSec that goes into that, starting with, for example, purchasing domains. Usually we have to have domains associated with whether it be the phishing servers, the web servers that are going to host our payloads, team servers, redirectors, etc. And every time we purchase a domain, we always want to put privacy associated with that, so there's no whois information and stuff like that associated with that domain. That's something very important. Whenever we purchase SSL certificates, we'll generally get wildcards like star.domain.com or something like that. And that helps avoid getting caught by brand reputation service monitoring. So that's also important when we're purchasing SSL certificates. With web servers and phishing servers, we like to put a proxy in front of the web servers to filter requests and control traffic. That's also really important. It helps us evade what we call prodding from blue teams and third-party security services. That's another really big important one.
Yeah, we've seen attackers doing that same thing where they'll have kind of these first level servers, essentially proxies, to hide their real C2. So even if you find the proxies, they can replicate those or replace those very easily. And we don't really end up getting to the actual server that contains the data that maybe they're using for exfil or data theft, or really where they're operating the bots from or the payloads from.
For sure. Yeah. And in fact, I think, we've observed some of those on the incident response side, and we took that kind of TTP and applied it on the red team, which is a nice nice little perk to have as working with FireEye and seeing what you guys see on the front lines. Going back to domain reputation, this is also really important when it comes to domains. We like to build our little domain babies and grow them over time when it comes to reputation. Some we like to have some historic reputation where we'll have a domain for a whole year. We'll put a website on there. We'll categorize it as a specific sort of category, whether it be like news or whether it be retail or whatever. And a lot of web proxies, this will get by a lot of web proxies that essentially block domains based on reputation and or historical reputation. So it's something that we like to do when it comes to domain reputation and building those out. Another thing that's really, really important when it comes to our C2 infrastructure, we like to use Cobalt Strike as for our C2 infrastructure. And there's like a lot associated with this. This is like, it's also Cobalt Strike, by the way, is used by APT groups as well. And this is something that we've seen on the front lines. I'm sure everyone else has probably seen that as well. It's a great C2 framework, not supposed to be used for that sort of thing, but nonetheless, attackers will abuse that just like anything else that they can get their hands on. And what we like to do with that is we use what they call domain fronting, which for those of you who are not familiar with that, there's a blog post on our FireEye site where you can learn more about that and tons of other online publications to learn more about domain fronting. But essentially what that is we use CDNs, which is content development networks, that will allow us to essentially masquerade traffic that goes to legitimate traffic, but then gets redirected to our C2 server. So that as far as a victim organization that's connecting out to our C2 server, it looks like it's going to a specific domain that's legitimate, but in reality, that's getting redirected from the content delivery network, the CDN, back to our C2 traffic. So it's really difficult to detect that in real life. And it's something that we've implemented to help avoid detection around some of our C2 channels. And with Cobalt Strike specifically, they have what they call malleable C2 profiles. And if you just use a malleable C2 profile out of the box, you'll likely get detected. There's a lot of things in these profiles that get caught, things like user agent strings, the URIs, the HTTP methods, the get and post variables that are sent back and forth over the wire. Even some of the post-execution or post-compromise phases of this, like for example, how it does process injection. This is like a really good example. There's oftentimes where there's parent-to-child process behavior that are getting detected after you compromise a system and then use some of the built-in functionality within Cobalt Strike that we like to change. And we change it to look for something that's a little bit more realistic or a little bit something commonly seen. So a really good example of this is if you look at the parent process search indexer, the child process search protocol host, that's a very common thing that you see. So if we changed our malleable C2 profile to do process injection using that parent process with that child process, it's going to look very legitimate and not commonly seen, versus if you use the malleable C2 profile out of the box, it will likely get caught. And not necessarily attributed to you specifically from an OpSec perspective, but it's definitely OpSec when it comes to avoiding detection. And that's also really important because kind of like what Julian said, you want to try to stay on the network for a while. You don't want to get detected. Real APT groups will stay on the network sometimes for years, sometimes for months, weeks. And it's because we implement this OpSec that it helps us remain undetected and stay on the network for longer. Now go ahead, Julie.
I think the longest dwell time that we have, if you guys have heard of the Mandiant dwell time, it's the time between when the attacker penetrated or compromised the network and when the organization declared an incident. And the longest dwell time I've heard of is over 2,000 days where the attacker was inside the environment before the client realized and even started to investigate. So definitely can be a very long time, like Evan was saying. And just before you go on to the next point, the question that comes up a lot is how do we detect domain fronting? Right, from an investigator perspective, because it can actually be very difficult. And domain fronting works on the principle of SSL, right? And so that's what's essentially masking, the real destination is inside of an encrypted connection. So if you are doing SSL man in the middle, one of the ways, which is not 100% guarantee, is comparing the host header parameter inside of the actual HTTP request to where the SSL connection was originally established, and that would be a mismatch. So the initial connection would be to the content delivery network, and then inside of the actual HTTP request, in the host header parameter would be the real C2 server address or C2 server, FQDN. So that's a way that you can start to try and identify domain fronting if it happens. But even then, that kind of mismatch does happen normally as well. So it's not a silver bullet to let's just get SSL man in the middle, but you would need that to try and figure out if that's happening, or try to look at some of those and detect these malleable C2 profiles that Evan's talking about.
So Julian, in your experience, for those sort of detections, what technologies would be in place that can identify that?
A lot of web proxy software has the ability to implement SSL man in the middle, so that you can actually do decryption of SSL. So if ideally most organizations, if you are trying to do this, would enforce a web proxy software on your endpoints, so that every web request coming out of your users' systems or your servers goes through the web proxy, and that can allow you to also filter by category and by content that's being accessed, and then at that point, start to do SSL decryption and inspect the encrypted connections. Ideally, you want to do SSL decryption on all categories. I've heard of firms that say, well, we won't decrypt anything that's classified as financial services, because we don't want to decrypt our users' online banking when they're checking their online banking, because we don't want to snoop on our employees. But then what does that mean? Well, the red teams or the APTs of the world will classify their C2 domains as financial services, so that you're not inspecting that traffic.
One other point to make on web proxies, just while we're on the subject, and this is going to sound silly to some of you, and for others, this may be eye-opening, is there is often times where people will purchase a web proxy, deploy it in their environment, and there are firewall rules configured still to allow hosts to go directly outbound on port 80 or 443. The way that you implement a web proxy in this situation is that you force every single host on your environment to go through the web proxy, and the only thing that should be allowed outbound on any sort of web port, it doesn't even have to just be 80 or 443, it could be 8080 or whatever. That web proxy should be the only system within the environment that allows outbound connection. And sometimes people only have it on user workstations, for example, to go through the web proxy, but not servers. So then we can put an implant on the server to go directly outbound on any sort of web port and bypass the proxy altogether, which, per what Julian was just saying, that avoids a lot of detection. It avoids categories detection. It avoids some of these SSL decryption technology capabilities. So it's really important that people implement and configure web proxies properly whenever they're deploying web proxies within their environment.
Yeah, that's a huge one. We see that a lot of times on IR, where the organization has a proxy, but it's not enforced. And like Evan said, then the attacker deploys a payload that simply bypasses and makes a direct connection out, and they have limited visibility now, or even ability to detect or prevent.
Exactly. One more note back to the Cobalt Strike OpSec is a lot of times there's this thing called Aggressor Scripts, which is essentially a scripting language within Cobalt Strike that allows any sort of red teamer or attacker alike to automate certain tasks. And there's a lot of aggressor scripts that actually are OpSec supported, like where they'll enable OpSec for the engagement. So for example, if there are built-in commands within Cobalt Strike that you want to avoid your team using or the red team to use because you know it's going to get caught, a great example of this is like PowerShell. We don't ever use the command PowerShell within Cobalt Strike because it essentially just wraps an invoke expression command around it, and that's generally detected by common EDRs these days. So instead, we'd rather use something like execute assembly, which executes like a C# equivalent of whatever script we're trying to run. And that gets injected into memory in a certain way that avoids certain detections or even command line arguments in this case. So if I want to avoid my team using that PowerShell command, you can implement OpSec aggressor scripts so that whenever someone runs that command, it displays a message saying, hey, don't run that command because you're probably going to get caught. So that's another way to help your team anyway avoid detections from an OpSec perspective.
I kind of like that one because it's a little bit comical to me in the sense that in the past, compiled executables were the way to go, and then they were getting detected so much that everyone transitioned to PowerShell because PowerShell was this nice way of using a built-in component of the Windows operating system to perform your operations. And now there's been so much focus on PowerShell that, hey, actually, if we use PowerShell, now we're going to get detected. Let's go back to .NET Assembly or compiled executables because those are less detected now than. And so it's kind of a funny. We went from this old way to this new, which back to the old, which is new again. Anyways, I always like that whenever that comes up because it's comical to me.
Yeah, who knows? We may get back to PowerShell in the next couple of years. This with this industry and the different TTPs that we see, there's always some new research that comes out that makes the old new again.
Exactly.
And it's funny how that works for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think we covered some pretty good points around infrastructure and how we do it on the red team. I didn't go into the nitty gritty of everything specifically, but yet, a good overview. And just to emphasize, infrastructure is really key when it comes to OpSec. From, again, not just on the red team, but attackers do the same stuff that we're talking about right now. And it's important for a lot of different reasons. But it's also important for defenders to know about, so they can start implementing some countermeasures to help detect on some of these activities that attackers are using to avoid some detections in OpSec.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, actually, especially when sometimes firms ask me, hey, well, we've got these IOCs and we searched our firewall logs, we searched our proxy logs, and we didn't find a match, so we think we're good. Well, sophisticated attackers are setting up these domains and infrastructure for specific attacks. They may not necessarily be reusing them. Our red team is pretty diligent about setting up new infrastructure per campaign, and sophisticated attackers are the same way. So even if you get intelligence about an attack group and it gives you a list of IPs and domains that they used, don't assume that if you just search your logs and your data for those IPs and domains and you don't find anything, that doesn't mean that attack group hasn't targeted you or have compromised you. You have to still look at the general patterns of their techniques and start to apply that in a more intelligent way than just kind of basic atomic indicator matching.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Julian. It's definitely important to stay diligent and follow the process thoroughly to make sure you cover your bases there. So past infrastructure is going to be our payloads, right? I mean, we definitely need to secure our payloads in one form or fashion. And something that I see a lot of newer red teamers do is they'll have an Office document, for example, that they're going to use for a phishing email. And this Office document is going to be macro enabled with some sort of malicious macro that will execute a payload on the system. And generally by default, right, whenever you create any sort of Office document, it's going to have metadata associated with that. And that metadata will include things like the author. It's going to include things like the computer name that it was put on. It's going to have timestamps on there as well. And if you don't clear that metadata and you send that off, like one of the number one things an incident responder is going to do if that is detected as a phishing email is look at the metadata for that Office document. And that's going to have direct attribution to a specific person if that matches their name or their computer name. And sometimes it could even be associated with a computer name that's associated with a domain, like let's just say computer.fireeye.com if it's on an internal domain and it has like the fully qualified internal domain associated with it. So definitely important to clear metadata. Again, common mistake for a lot of new red teamers that we've observed, and attackers alike. But sometimes people have what they call build servers whenever you build a payload, and they just do it with these build servers. Like on our red team, we have build servers that do everything for us so that there's zero attribution associated with us or our computer names or anything associated with our domain, so that there's no real way that specific payload would have metadata associated with it.
Yeah, some attackers are diligent about this, and other times our intelligence team is able to find certain things inside executables, even if the attacker is, tried to strip out as much of the metadata as they can. If they're not very diligent, then there are, some of these links that our intel team uses to start to build these clusters of activity. And so they'll cluster activity typically under what they call an uncategorized group. You might hear of those in some of the FireEye blog posts and so forth. And then as they cluster more activity and find more details about these uncategorized groups, they may join them together and release an APT or FIN designation at some point. But very, very important that attackers remove those. Otherwise, it does allow for either attribution or correlation of activities beyond, multiple or through multiple campaigns.
Yeah, so for a defender, I guess it's going to be something to note is like, don't be surprised if there's not metadata associated with an Office document, because it's generally best practice from an attacker's perspective to clean those off. And if you're another initial vector payload that we use when it comes to like phishing is going to be click once sort of binaries that we develop. Those are generally hosted on a website and then are downloaded by a victim, executed, and that gives us a callback in itself. Those are created with Visual Studio almost all the time, and Visual Studio has publication information, including metadata and version associated with that. So whenever you're creating any sort of .NET application, some of that metadata may remain unless it's cleared out through Visual Studio whenever you're actually trying to publish or compile that binary. So that's another common mistake that we see newer red teamers or attackers with less OpSec experience do whenever they're developing their own payloads within Visual Studio.
Mm-hmm. So some of the best OpSec we see is even where the attackers don't just strip it out, but they'll replace it with something that they know fits in with how they're trying to masquerade that executable. And so if they make it very sophisticated and it makes it seem really reasonable, even when an analyst is looking at it, they might see content there that seems to be okay and may not question it. Whereas if it's stripped out, that can also sometimes be an indicator of, hey, there should be some metadata here. Why is this all gone? So sometimes we see them replacing it with something very, very convincing.
Speaking of the replacing, like if I'm doing an engagement, generally I prep for that engagement a week prior, right? We're setting up infrastructure, everything I just mentioned, but also creating the payloads associated with that C2 server. So like kind of like Julian mentioned, we set up new infrastructure per engagement that we run, which means it's going to be a new fully qualified domain name associated with that, a new IP address, which means new payloads that are going to be pointing to those. So I have to compile those payloads on a per engagement basis, which means that the dates and timestamps associated with that are going to be fairly new. So sometimes we'll want to timestamp those so that it looks a little bit older, because some people just simply will be like, hey, this was compiled like yesterday. Like that's kind of suspect. Like how often does that really happen in our environment? Julian, what are your observations around that when it comes to like real attackers and or even what you're looking for in terms of detections around stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the compile time is one place that is fairly good for us. Not a lot of attackers actually modify the compilation time. And like you said, in a lot of cases, especially with less sophisticated attackers who have poorer operational security, the compile time is like a few days before we see it being loaded into the client environment, even if they do what is known as time stomping, where they modify the timestamps on the file. Time stomping, can just modify the outside or exterior timestamps, like modified time, created time, access time. But if you're doing thorough time stomping, you should be also modifying the compile time that's embedded within the executable. And so we don't see it that often, but with the most sophisticated attackers, we would expect that they'd be doing it, although it's not always the case. Even with some of the highest level sophisticated attackers, they don't bother to modify that compile time, which can be a cool clue, especially if they're replicating binaries and they just generate one payload and then they modify it or pack it, but that compile time is still the same across multiple executables that have different hash values and are slightly different. It can be a nice way to do correlation between those.
Yeah, for sure. I would imagine that if you're doing any sort of live response analysis and you see a suspect binary around the timeline that you're looking for of when the attack happened, and there was a specific binary that was compiled like yesterday, whenever or very soon after, or very recently from the initial time that you identified the detection, that would definitely be a suspicious binary to look into more.
Exactly.
And then whenever you're reverse engineering that, there'll be a lot more data associated with that as well. So speaking of getting execution and sort of some of this, now we're kind of going into the post-compromise activities, Julian. One of the things I do want to mention, whenever we're operating in an environment, at least on the red team side, if we have any systems that are communicating with the victim organization, we generally try to avoid common system names that could get detected. Like something very, very common right out of the box is Kali. Like the system name for Kali is called Kali. If you kept it the same and you're operating, or there's like a proxy or some sort of connection between the two, or you're on the internal environments, like if you're doing an internal pen test or something and you keep it called Kali, that sort of OpSec is going to get you caught for sure. Maybe not attribution associated with you, but nonetheless, for sure going to get detected. Do you observe that commonly on your end, Julian?
Yeah, it's definitely more common than you'd think. And sometimes it's, makes it easier to detect. Things like Kali for sure are very obvious, or sometimes attackers will set up systems, where they launch their attacks from, or especially if they're doing interactive activity. So those machines might have really basic names like something -PC, which obviously doesn't match the naming convention of the client's organization. So when we're reviewing all the logs and we see all of the logon events across the environment that match the client's naming convention for their assets, and all of a sudden there's an RDP connection coming from user-PC. Now that starts to stand out, and more sophisticated attackers will actually name the host names after the client's environment, so that masks it, but it's not as common. So we do definitely see a lot of times the attackers just using an arbitrary name. One case I'm working on right now, the attacker's host name is Toolbox. So it makes it very easy for us to say, well, any logon associated with this host toolbox, which doesn't exist in the client environment, is associated with those attacker connections.
Speaking of that as well, when it comes to persistence, which is a really important phase of the attack lifecycle, because that's where a small piece of evidence is almost always going to get left behind, and probably your biggest risk of compromising your engagement or getting detected in this case, aside from the initial vector payload via phishing email. A lot of people, in terms of attackers, will use VPN for persistence if it's possible. VPN is always like the number one way to persist an internal network if you can do that, because you don't have to put any binaries on a system. You don't have to change anything. You can just simply connect into the internal network as you please. And a lot of times we try to use legitimate user accounts to persist a VPN, as opposed to creating new accounts or using some sort of illegitimate account. That's something that we commonly see as well. And if we're going to use a binary to persist a system, so if we're doing host-based persistence versus network-based persistence, we try to blend in with legitimate file locations or file names and try to avoid any sort of outliers that would be pretty obvious whenever someone's doing a live response analysis on our victim.
Yeah, I worked a really interesting case last year where a sophisticated attacker was targeting a medical organization that was involved in COVID vaccine research. And they were using unique payloads per system that they compromised. Each payload had been, uniquely compiled, named, and the naming convention followed what would either be looking like a legitimate application on the system or a Windows component with a unique persistence mechanism. I think they were using scheduled tasks, each named in a way that matched that specific executable. And it was very, very well done in the sense that even if you found one, you said, okay, I found this one executable with this one scheduled task name, and it's named this binary name. I searched the entire environment for that. You won't find any matches because they kind of used this unique method on every single one, although ultimately it was still the same kind of compiled executable scheduled task combination that they were replicating across the network. What's your favorite technique for persistence 7? Do you have a preference other than VPN, obviously?
Yeah, I was going to say VPN for sure. So for those of you who aren't aware, there's a public version of Sharp Persist, which is a C# assembly that we released. It's on our FireEye GitHub page that has like a whole bunch of different techniques for persistence that's publicly available. And of those, I would say that's a good question. Honestly, it depends on a per environment and our observations. WMI persistence using a different class than Win32 process execution, for example, has been something that we recently been doing. Even some sort of COM objects, to be honest with you. One of my favorite ones is going to be COM object abandonment, when there's an existing COM object that points to a DLL that no longer exists, and you simply just replace or you put your DLL in where that COM object DLL was supposed to be, and that existing COM object gets run on startup. That's something you just simply put a file on disk and everything else is already there for you. And that COM object gets executed on, depending if the COM object gets executed on startup, then it will execute for you. That's also really cool because you don't have to make any sort of changes. It's essentially just a COM object that points to a DLL that is no longer on disk. That one's really cool. It's fairly advanced and sophisticated. Another really good one that I really love, this is my number one, is going to be any sort of service misconfiguration that is pointing to like an unquoted service path. And you can, create an unquoted service path to a service that's not really that valid. Like it doesn't require much functionality. So if, for example, that service doesn't get pointed to the service binary or the service DLL, and if nothing ever happens, like it's not going to disrupt functionality whatsoever, you can create the misconfiguration that is an unquoted service path pointed to your DLL or your executable and execute yours instead. That one's really good too, because one, you're not creating a new service, so there's no service creation event. And two, that existing service will get executed generally with system level privileges. So you have system level persistence at that point. Those are probably going to be my top 3. I really like those.
I like how you can just right off your head go for top 3. That's pretty awesome. Beyond, of course, VPN. And like Evan said, VPN is probably the most preferred way that we're starting to see attackers maintain persistence beyond some of these cool, sophisticated methods, just because it blends in with the attacker or blends in with normal user behavior, right? Someone logging into your VPN from a remote system or remote IP address, that's normal, depending on the source IP address. And especially, I think, within the last year or so, we started to see a lot of this because of a vulnerability in a very common SSL VPN platform. So the Fortinet SSL VPN platform had a vulnerability, unfortunately, which allowed an attacker to dump credentials that had been currently cached on the device. So if an attacker exploited this, they could essentially collect creds and then just log in via VPN. And so we started to see a lot of campaigns that had this characteristic, but we do also see attackers who maybe fish their way in with a malicious email and then pivot to the VPN because that allows them to, essentially go dark in the network. It makes it harder for them to be detected. There's no payload or backdoor for someone to trigger on or detect. It's just users connecting, which nowadays in the day of, the times of everyone being at home and working from home or more remotely if possible is very common in the environment.
For sure. Well, you have anything to talk about in terms of persistence, since we're on this, about web shells, Julian? Web shell in itself can be a way to persist an environment externally as well. And by the way, on the Red Team side, if you ever use a web shell externally facing to persist a network, please always, one, implement IP address whitelisting associated with your domain only, and two, password protected on top of that. Like, the last thing you want to do is introduce a new vulnerability that allows other attackers to use the same or abuse the same web shell that you just, put on that system. But in terms of web shells, do you see that commonly used to persist systems as well, Julian?
That's a good question. I think web shells were really common in the past. So the main form before phishing became the number one form of, infection of in a network, used to be attackers would scan your websites or your web servers, anything on the internet, compromise them via a vulnerability, and upload a web shell. And then they would use that for both persistence and command execution in the network. Nowadays, we're starting to see not quite as much, although that still does happen. There is a recent case that I'll talk about a bit later when we talk about anti-forensics, where web shells were used. And we sometimes see where attackers will come in a different way, like via phishing email with those, malicious Word documents, and then deploy web shells on an internet-facing server, because if their payloads or backdoors are detected, they still have this web shell that is left behind that they can use. And sometimes we actually see the attackers place the web shell, but they don't use it. It almost seems like it's a backup mechanism. So if their first primary mechanism is removed for their access to the network, whether VPN or a backdoor, they'll still have this web shell that they've placed and kind of set up in advance. And so that can be also a nice mechanism that's there that really isn't doing anything, right? A web shell is just a web page, essentially, if you're not too familiar. It's just a web page added to the web server that doesn't do anything unless somebody accesses this web page, and maybe allows them to run commands in the most basic form, or even have full capabilities like exploitation and scanning and so forth.
Since you mentioned the anti-forensics, so maybe we should just jump right into that. And you have some experience with the web shells and anti-forensics?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting one recently where a certain, file sharing software had a vulnerability that was being exploited, and the attackers were uploading a web shell to this essential appliance, this Linux-based appliance. And what I think was really interesting about this particular anti-forensics capability of the web shell was that the attacker had built in a kill switch. So if they were detected and they sent a kill switch to the web shell would not only delete itself from the system, but it would actually go through all of the Apache logs on that server, look for references related to the web shell. So it would look for line items that actually reference the web shell being used. So that might include command line arguments, or command arguments that were being passed to the web shell, or even just when it was being used and how frequently. And it would edit out those lines of the Apache log. Once it edited out those lines, it would store that in a temporary file, and then it would overwrite the original log with this new edited version, so that any reference to the web shell having been used is now gone from the machine. So the web shell is gone. Any reference to it having been used is removed from the logs, which is pretty sophisticated, right? That's a nice kill switch the attacker has available to them. If they think someone's onto them and investigating, they can hit that button, and now they've kind of cleaned up their tracks. And that's becoming more and more common, these kill switches, that attackers have the capability to come in and clean up after themselves as they learn more about our forensic techniques to identify what they were doing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So going back to the whole using Intel to kind of lead the way you operate from a Red Team perspective, this is a really good example of stuff that we observe on the front lines, and also observing what we do on the forensic side to implement new TTPs as part of our Red Team methodologies to do exactly what he's just describing. So if we're going to use web shells, this is actually not a bad idea. And we actually have samples of this kill switch, like internally, that we can observe and implement into our own methodology and in our toolkit, which is also like just really, really cool. I think that about covers most of what we're going to talk about today in terms of operational security and attacker operational security versus red team operational security and why it's important. So please stay tuned, and we'll catch you on the next episode next month. Join, any last minute comments?
Thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Feel free always to reach out to Evan and I if you have any questions or want to touch base or chat about anything. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
See you guys next time.